Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program. My name is Lee Pfeffer, and I am the manager of museum experience here at the GLBT Historical Society, and I thank you for joining us tonight or today, wherever you're tuning in from. I want to, before we start our program, start by acknowledging that the GLBT Historical Society is based on Ohlone tribal land, and I invite any Indigenous folks with us today to make themselves visible and recognized in the chat as we honor the contemporary and ancestral lives of America's Indigenous peoples. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel and our website. And if you're watching live with us, we welcome your active participation in the chat and encourage you to post comments, observations, and questions for our speaker. Before I turn it over to tonight's speaker, I would like to also tell you a little bit about the Society and the work that we do. Founded in 1985, the Gay, Lesbian, Bisexual, Transgender, or GLBT Historical Society is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of LGBTQ public history. Our mission is to collect, preserve, exhibit, and make accessible to the public materials and knowledge to support and promote understanding of LGBTQ history, culture, and arts in all their diversity. Our operations are centered around two sites: the GLBT Historical Society Museum, located in the heart of San Francisco's Castro neighborhood since 2011, and the Dr. John P. DeCecco Archives and Research Center in the Mid-Market District. While our facilities are closed to the public right now due to coronavirus, please check out our ongoing and growing array of exhibitions, events, and archival resources online at glbthistory.org. Finally, I would like to thank all of our members and donors who make our work possible every day. If you're not already a card-carrying member of the Society, I invite you to consider joining today. Members get a variety of perks, including a 20% discount on purchases of cool swag from our online store. We recently just added masks, and access to special members-only events and various other fun things throughout the year. You can learn more about how to become a member and other ways to support the Society by visiting glbthistory.org/join-give. Thank you again for being here, and now I would like to introduce our wonderful speaker tonight. His name is Sean Mobley, and he combines his love of history and storytelling at his job as volunteer coordinator at the Museum of Flight, where he manages the museum's 225 docents. He also writes for Aloft, the museum's magazine, and runs The Flight Deck, the museum's podcast, which emphasizes sharing the stories of underrepresented aerospace voice to listeners around the world. So let's bring him into the chat. Hi, Sean. How are you doing?
Lee. I'm doing well. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you here tonight. We've got some wonderful folks already in the comments here, and so I'm excited to learn a whole bunch about LGBTQ aerospace history. So I'm going to turn it over to you, and you have a wonderful presentation for us, and then we will spend the final part of the evening with some Q&A. So folks, please feel free at any time, if you have a question for Sean that you would like us to answer at the end of the evening, put it in the chat, and I'll be keeping an eye out for it. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'll emphasize, by the way, what Lee just said, that the online presence for the GLBT Archives and GLBT Historical Society is phenomenal. This presentation that you're seeing here, I've been working on for about 2 years and been presenting for about a year, and it's evolved a lot over those 2 years and would not be what it is today without the oral histories, especially in your archives. So I encourage anybody with any passing interest in anything GLBT history, check out their site. I am here with the Museum of Flight. As was said, the Museum of Flight, for those who don't know, is located up in Seattle, Washington, just south of downtown. Some of you might have visited. If so, feel free to put in chat. And if not, I hope we get to see you at some point in the future. The Museum of Flight is the largest independent private nonprofit air and space museum in the world. We're spread out over a couple buildings on 2 campuses. For those of you who might be locals here, you might have heard of us as the Boeing Museum, which is a common misconception. We're not officially affiliated with Boeing or any government entity, though we have a lot of Boeing artifacts, including the Red Barn, which is the original Boeing factory. But we proudly talk about aerospace history for all sorts of eras and from all sorts of people. As was stated a little bit about me, I'm Sean Mobley. I work with our volunteers and also run the Museum of Flight podcast, and I'm so thrilled to be here. As we get into the talk, I am curious. Why are you here today? What is your interest in this topic? I'm going to invite you in the chat to share. If you feel comfortable, put in a comment. What is it that drew you to this talk? It sounded interesting, or you were just looking for something to do on a Friday night. Now, I will say that because of the way we're doing this, there's a lag time between the broadcast and you receiving it, so I won't be able to check the comments as it's happening, but I do want to go back and take a look at what y'all said afterwards. And I will be doing this a couple times through this talk. I'll be pausing and giving you a chance to respond if you want. It's always challenge by choice. You don't have to answer if you don't want to. But I do love reading what you have to say and having this chance to do some small interaction. There are 3 themes to this talk today. The first is that documenting the history of marginalized populations is tough but vital. And I know to the staff at the GLBT Historical Society, I'm preaching to the choir. We're also going to talk about how aerospace history is gender and sexual minority history, or GSM history. We have a tendency to like to section off pieces of history, right? We've got women's history over here, and American history over here, and African American history over here, and this and that and the other. But the reality is all of these are intertwined and they're inseparable from each other. And the same goes true for aerospace history and gender and sexual minority history. You can't talk about one truthfully without talking about the other. The aerospace industry evolved thanks to the presence of GSM people through its whole history, and the GSM community has evolved as a result of aerospace history. We're also going to talk about this concept of the ideal American. What is the ideal American, and how has that changed over time? And what has that meant for the GSM community? A couple of notes on vocabulary. First of all, you've heard me use a term that you may or may not be familiar with, gender and sexual minority, GSM. This is an umbrella term. It's similar to LGBTQ+. It's interchangeable, to be honest, but it's shorter. And I think it's more defaultly representative. So it's a term I'm going to be using from here on out. We're also talking about history here. And so where I can, I try to let the people I talk about speak for themselves. And that means using vocabulary or words that they use to describe themselves and to identify themselves, which may or may not be the words that we use today. Now, if you hear one of those words, I'm going to ask you to remember 2 things. One, this is how they're describing their experience. And another, it's just a good opportunity for us to reflect and rejoice that we live in a time where queer people can really assert their identity and change language in the process. In places where I don't use contemporary language, I do my best to make it obvious that I'm applying a modern term to a person's historical experience. Kind of along those same lines, I like to do a quick community agreement before we go into the bulk of the presentation. Mainly, this is just a note to ask that you assume positive intent from people, myself included. We're all here to learn, again, myself included. So I want this to be a space for you to be able to ask questions and wonder and be curious. And sometimes it can feel inelegant to do that. And I want you to feel welcome to ask questions and probe, and for other people to understand that if someone's asking a question, they're doing it out of a desire to learn. I'm also going to ask you to practice empathy and really be open to experiences other than yourself, other than your own. And also just be aware we are going to talk about some tough topics. They might hit a little close to home for some people, and that's okay. Feel free, of course, to excuse yourself, or feel free to even disagree with something you hear here. Just be open to learning more. So what we're going to work with tonight, first of all, we are not just going to talk about pilots. Pilots get a lot of attention in the aviation world, but they're not it when it comes to aviation. We're going to be talking about people both within and without the aerospace world who nonetheless had an impact on aviation. We're also specifically focusing on stories in the United States. So there are some people from aviation history outside the United States whose stories are very important. One that comes to mind for me is Roberta Cowell, who was a trans woman in World War II. She flew for the Royal Air Force, where she flew Spitfires, has some amazing stories in her autobiography there, and then later on underwent what we would today call gender confirmation surgery. She was the first trans woman in Britain to undergo it, and is a pretty landmark figure in GSM history. But her story is not part of what we're going to talk about today, which is one reason I like to highlight her at the beginning, because she is awesome, and I think you should look her up. The stories we cover are predominantly about white individuals, and I think that's important to mention and really name up front. We're not going to spend a lot of time with stories of people of color, and that's largely because their stories are not as readily available in the historical record. And I'm going to give you a chance here to reflect again. Why is that? Why are their stories not as readily available in places like museum archives or in books or biographies? I'm going to give you a second to type out an answer if you so choose. I will say that I continue to evolve this presentation. Like I said, I've been giving this for a year now after about 2 years of research, and continue to change it and evolve it. So if there are people of color specifically who you know of, who you think should be included, I really want to hear from you. I'll leave my contact information at the end, or you can drop it in the comments and I'll be taking a look through them later. Okay, off we go. We're going to start our journey with World War I, specifically this piece of World War I ephemera, which is a program for something called the Pink Stocking. The Pink Stocking is a drag-based play that was performed in World War I in Paris, France. There were a lot after World War I ended, before they could get all of the American soldiers back over. There were a lot of soldiers over there not doing much, and so there were a lot of performances that were put on, including this one called the Pink Stocking. For a bit of local color, it actually starred a future Seattleite, Frank McCormick, who, if you live in the Seattle area, he moved up here in the 60s, and his partner, Stephen Blair, actually went on to sing in the Seattle Gay Men's Choir. But what we see here is a program. This is an aviation-themed drag play. The play's summary in the program says it's founded on the prevalent custom of an aviator receiving from someone of the fair sex a stocking, which he used as a helmet. I don't know if that was actually a tradition or not. But this was an entire cast of men playing mostly female roles. So, for example, Frank McCormick, who I mentioned, plays George Wilson, who is in love with Gladys. Gladys, of course, being played by a man. So this shows us a couple things. First of all, it shows a public interest in aviation. You might have heard of the Red Baron, the fighter pilot in World War I, and there's a lot of romantic notions about aviation in World War I. But the reality is World War I aviation was a sideshow. The war was not won or lost by planes the way aviation played a central role in later conflicts like World War II. But despite that, there's clearly a lot of public interest, enough for whole plays to be written from scratch in order to entertain the troops. It also demonstrates clear presence of GSM individuals in this kind of aviation world. The next person I'd like to meet is Josephine Baker. She was known for her stage presence, her civil rights activism. She actually participated in the March on Washington alongside Martin Luther King Jr., and her larger-than-life rags to riches story. Now, she, as an African-American, was unable to find success in the United States. There were a lot of places that just wouldn't let her perform because of her skin color. So she went over to Paris, France, where she found a lot of success. She rose to prominence in Paris, where her provocative dress and her dance really made her headlines and made her a star. On top of this, she had a pilot's license. In fact, this is a pretty obscure part of her story. And she spent some time actually barnstorming, which are the kind of the stunt pilots. She was kind of part of the barnstorming world when things on stage didn't necessarily work too well, in the Parisian countryside. In the 1930s, as Europe careened towards war, she flew supplies for the Red Cross in her Howard DGA-11. This is the type of plane you see on the right here. This is not her exact plane. That's the type of plane if you're interested in some of the more specific tech pieces. Later in World War II proper, she actually joined the French Resistance, where she was officially part of the Women's Auxiliary of the Free French Air Force. And she becomes someone who's a lot like Mata Hari before her. She uses her cover as a well-known performer to conduct espionage on the Nazis. People figured she was just there to perform, but she was secretly listening in and then providing information back to the Allies through the Free French Air Force. Her status as a queer icon has been around for decades. Her decadent, over-the-top style was emulated by drag performers and still is. Back in the mid-1900s, we have drag queens who are wearing their hair in the Josephine style or lip-syncing to her song. And as recently as 2018, here we have drag queen Monique Hart wearing a look inspired directly by Josephine Baker. And this is Monique wearing this on national TV, which I think is a really cool full circle moment. Here we have Josephine Baker in her famous banana dress, and she couldn't find a stage that would let her perform because she was Black. And then here we are 100 years later, and we have an African-American drag queen on TV on the national stage emulating her. Now, the reality of Baker's life is shrouded in a lot of myth and mystery, in large part for her own design. She really cultivated this over-the-top image of herself. And there's been a lot of rumors of her own bisexuality. And then historians have not really had the chance yet to make a serious effort to separate fact from fiction there, although the GLBT Historical Society has a folder on her that I would love to get my hands on once we can get into physical spaces again, because it might have some good concrete information in there. But regardless of the reality of her own sexuality, she is without question a queer icon whose aviation story is virtually unknown. As the United States enters into World War II, there's not a lot of official policy on GSM soldiers. There are rules forbidding sodomy, which is this very vague term that includes a lot of things. It includes homosexual acts, usually only between men, so there's not much mention about women. And it also includes things like bestiality and a number of other things that have nothing to do with homosexuality, but were nonetheless lumped in under this title of sodomy. But there really wasn't much beyond that, and that changed over the early days of the war. Henry Stack Sullivan was responsible for a lot of this change. Now, Sullivan was a respected psychoanalyst, and as the United States was moving towards World War II, psychologists thought that they could help the military, especially with what was then called shell shock, what today we would call post-traumatic stress. Psychologists thought that they could provide the military with a framework to weed out people who would be more susceptible to shell shock. The psychology of the time thought that there were certain characteristics that made a person more susceptible to PTSD. Of course, today we know it comes from witnessing things that humans should never have to witness, but that wasn't the understanding they had back then. So they helped develop a screening for the military based on the prevailing psychology of the time, with this list of disqualifying factors. And this was seen as a win-win-win. It was a win for the military because they would theoretically get a fighting force that would cost less to maintain, that would be more effective because they wouldn't have to deal with as much medical care. And it's a win for the psychologists because this was a relatively young science at the time, and was a bit of a punching bag. I mean, even today, we think of psychologists as head shrinkers, and there's lots of jokes about psychology. And linking up with the military would be a chance for psychologists to get a lot of legitimacy. In the United States, we draw a lot of credibility from what the military thinks. And so by getting in line and getting the military in line with psychology, it's a signal that, hey, this is a real thing. Psychology is not a punchline. So as they built this list, the list grew and grew but kind of conspicuously for the time, it did not include anything about homosexuality. Now, that changed pretty quickly as Sullivan kind of lost control of this list of factors that went through military bureaucracy on its way to getting implemented, and homosexuality was quickly added to the list of factors that made a person an inferior soldier. So for the first time, the United States is now screening out people for their identity when it comes to their GSM, their gender or sexual identity. Now, there's a bit of a punchline to this, which is that Sullivan had been in a relationship with another man for at least a decade by the time the war broke out. So he kind of accidentally created this mechanism by which, for the next 60, 70 years, GSM individuals were excluded from the military service. And so these screenings for the first time codified the systemic exclusion of GSM people from the military's definition of the ideal American. And like I said, in the United States, we draw a lot of credibility from what the military thinks. Regardless, GSM people still served in World War II. One such person was Helen Harder. Helen was in high school when she met another student named Hollis, who in her oral history, she's got a great oral history in the GLBT Historical Society archives. She describes Hollis as, quote, gay as a widget, whatever that means. And he introduced her to the fact that there were others like her in her town and her school. She wanted to fly when World War II came about. She liked aviation. She'd actually built a glider with a couple of boys in her class. She'd snuck down to the airport to watch planes take off, all sorts of things like that. But she was unable to fly because she was a woman, and women weren't allowed to fly in the military. So she ended up joining the Women's Army Corps, where she eventually became a link trainer instructor as part of a link school. Now, for those who don't know, the link trainer was called a synthetic trainer back then. Today, we would call it a simulator. And here's a photo of it. This is actually at the Museum of Flight. We've got 3 link trainers in our collection. This one's on display in our World War II exhibit. And so this was used for learning how to fly without seeing, so only using your instruments. And the aviator would get inside there, close the hood, and they just have their instruments inside, and it would be connected to a pen that drew on a map. And people like Helen would be watching that map, giving them instructions, and then debriefing them afterwards. And in her oral history, she describes this really extensive underground lesbian and gay culture on her base. Another quote I love from her oral history, she says, quote, "The lesies were all in aerial photography," which she desperately tried to get in over the course of the war, but never was able to. And she was one of many millions of GSM Americans who served in World War II, either in the military or in support roles or in the contractors or in the industrial world. Our next person is someone you may recognize, and that is Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt was the wife of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and she was a pilot herself. She was a close friend of Amelia Earhart, and actually would probably have pursued some sort of career in aviation if her husband, FDR, hadn't asked her to stop studying for her pilot's license. But she still had this love for aviation throughout her life. There is a lot of evidence for either a lesbian or bisexual identity. She had relationship with several women to the extent that one eventually actually lost her job because of the relationship. And by that time, Eleanor Roosevelt was the first lady and actually secured her a job in the White House through her husband. It's important to note that her husband, FDR, also had several affairs with women. So she was not alone in this extramarital approach. She was pretty instrumental in the Tuskegee Airmen story. For those who don't know who the Tuskegee Airmen are, these are African-American pilots who flew fighter planes in combat during World War II. And there was a long road to hoe to get this program underway. Now, this photo here is Eleanor Roosevelt in the back of a plane being piloted by the chief civilian instructor Alfred Chief Anderson. Chief Anderson was his nickname there, taking her for a flight. Now, at this time, the program was still a civilian program when this photo was taken. And it's really hard to drive home how scandalous this photo is. From our perspective today, this looks like kind of a plain old photo, but at the time, you have to remember that the military's official position was that African Americans did not have the mental or physical capacity to do anything but menial work. They could cook, they could dig trenches, they could smile, but fly a plane? It's far too complex. And so to have a picture of the First Lady of the United States in a plane piloted by an African American, this is an incredibly scandalous photo. So Eleanor goes down to the field where this program is starting and gets in this plane, is flown for a 30-minute flight by Chief Anderson and lands. And when she gets out, she says simply, well, you can fly all right. Has this photo taken and uses this photo, takes it back to Washington and uses this photo to really help get the military and her husband especially behind the program. And a few months later, the Tuskegee military program officially begins in June of 1941. Now, the whole story is more complicated than this. I don't want to oversell her role in the creation of the Tuskegee Airmen. There were a lot of other people involved. This was certainly a big part of it. Now, statistically, there were a few dozen gay, bisexual, and trans people among the Tuskegee Airmen. But I have looked and looked and looked, and I found one very obscure interview of a Tuskegee Airman using a pseudonym. So even more obscure. And that's it when it comes to the historical record. So I'd really be curious. This is another chance for you to take a moment and respond in the chat. Why do you think it is specifically that within this program for African American pilots, we don't have a lot of examples to draw on and tell their story? Take a moment, put a thought in chat. All right. So World War II ends and the jet age begins. The jet age brings in new travel opportunities. And it also, of course, brought with it fresh opportunities for sexism and homophobia. Sexism against women kept them out of the cockpit. There were programs during the war that proved women could fly just as well as anybody else. That didn't matter once the war ended. Women who wanted to be involved in aviation, in airplanes specifically, ended up in the roles as stewardesses. And as stewardesses, they faced insurmountably high standards. They couldn't be married. If they were married, they had to be not pregnant. They had to be under a certain age. They had to maintain certain weights. The face of air travel was changing. And as travel became more accessible, more and more businessmen were choosing to fly. And there's always an undercurrent of sexism involving stewardesses. But in the jet age, she becomes more and more specifically and overtly a sex object. And airlines wanted to woo travel dollars by maintaining the most attractive cadre of women. Now, this had a cost to women. Most only remained as flight attendants for 2.5 years. That was the duration of the average woman in a flight attendant role, with up to 80% of stewardesses resigning in any given year or being fired in any given year. Can you imagine that? If in your workplace, 80% of your colleagues were gone every single year, and you were gone in probably 2 years. Men were involved here too. They acted as stewards alongside the female stewardesses. As stewards, they were often the only ones who were allowed to act as bursars or handle the money. This was something that women weren't allowed to do. And the career kind of became a haven of sorts for gay men. And there's a bit of a chicken and the egg question here. But there was some level of tolerance even in some airlines in that they weren't fired immediately, even if they weren't exactly secret about their sexual identity. And in fact, some of the airlines kind of took advantage of these stereotypes around homosexuality as the steward position and moved to one of comfort versus one of safety, which is how it started. Ellen Church, who's the first flight attendant in the United States, was a nurse, and that's how she tried to justify her work. Moved to one of comfort. Then stereotypes about gay men started coming into play. Providing comfort in our society is seen as a more feminine quality, and gay men are considered more effeminate. And so naturally, they would actually be a good fit for these roles. This was an important moment nationally for the GSM community because it was for many people who are now traveling on these planes the first time they had exposure to a kind of more obviously gay individual or more stereotypically gay individual. And similarly, because many of these men were somewhat open about their sexuality, at least to their coworkers, or at least they didn't hide it, it was for their female counterparts the first time many of these women, these stewardesses, had worked alongside gay men. And these are people who came from all over the country. A lot of them came from small towns. Airlines tolerated, but perhaps didn't love having these, what they would call, quote, sexual deviants working for them. Then they also understood, again, that the changing face of air travel. Male flight attendants were not what businessmen wanted to ogle, or at least what most businessmen wanted to ogle. And so there were some crackdowns in the late 1940s and the 1950s, this kind of post-war machismo that more clearly delineated male and female characteristics and roles. This is, remember, the era of the hard-boiled detective, the man's man. James Bond came out of this era. And remember also that homosexuality was for the first time officially a reason to be rejected from military service. Not just kicked out, but kept from even entering. And we draw a lot from military credibility. Delta fired almost all of their stewards and went pretty much exclusively with women in 1948. And this was a trend that was on its way out until August 1954 in Miami, when everything changed. This is William Simpson. He was a steward for Eastern Airlines. And in August 1954 in Miami, he was murdered. Specifically, he was murdered in a lover's lane outside of Miami. Now, there's a lot to unpack even in just that statement. The public implication of this was massive. So here we have a man who's in a stereotypically gay career, murdered in a lover's lane. So on top of already being part of this stereotypically queer career, he was murdered. And at the time, it was thought that women were too dainty to commit murder. So he must have been murdered by a man. The story twisted as it was unfolded. Police arrested 2 men for the murder. They claimed that Simpson had propositioned one of them, and so they held him up and robbed him. They shot him in self-defense, they claimed, because that they said that he was going to have his way with them. And in a panic, they ran, not realizing that they killed him. They said they only discovered he was dead when they read the newspapers the next day. Now, almost immediately, the police completely ripped this story to shreds. It does not jive with the details of the record of the order of events the night of the murder, nor with the killer's own confessions to the fact that they had carried out this same scheme for the last 5 months with other male victims. So they didn't just randomly get propositioned by somebody. Homophobia really kicked in, though, and twisted the story even further. Instead of the story of the murder of Simpson, which the police quickly extracted from the 2 arrested men once their story broke down, public sentiment instead turned the story into one of Simpson acting as a predator, who the 2 men killed out of fear that he might sodomize them. To the point that the 2 killers only ended up convicted of manslaughter, not murder, despite the pretty obvious nature of the crime. The murder had repercussions locally and nationally for the GSM community and the aviation community. Airlines used this as a catalyst to sweep men out of the airplane cabins. It wasn't all immediate, but within a few years, most airlines had adopted women-only policies. Miami used it to crack down on the thriving GSM community that was building in the city. Remember, this is an era where travel is growing. Miami is a hub, and lots of travel dollars are coming in as people are coming to Miami to go out to other parts of the world. And so the people in charge wanted to clean up the city and make it more presentable to a 1950s society. So this crackdown was so severe that it was reported in newspapers all the way in California. And this is a time before the internet. So a story would have to be pretty big in order for it to make it all the way across the country. The brief but brutal crusade fractured the community in Miami, but it couldn't go too far. The Miami police chief pointed out, quote, "If I ran all the homosexuals out of town, some members of some of the best families would lead the parade." The airplane cabin would remain the domain of the white stewardess for 15 years until the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and subsequent lawsuits by men who wanted to again work the friendly skies. Now, I want to be clear that there is plenty of injustice to go around. I'm in no way implying that these stewardesses who remained had it easy by any means. There were not many winners here, not the gay or straight men or gay or straight women working as stewards and stewardesses. They had a lot of battles ahead of them for equity and fair treatment. And this was a stigma that stayed, by the way. I've had a conversation with one of our docents who is a male flight attendant who joined up when they opened up again in the 60s. And he told me that one of the prerequisites was that he had to be married to a woman, because a guy married to a woman clearly could not be gay. This was one of the rules that they had in place. In the Vietnam War, we meet Leonard Matlovich. Leonard Matlovich served in Vietnam 3 tours for the United States Air Force. He was injured by a landmine. He had a spotless record. He was well-liked, and so he worked with the American Civil Liberties Union to become a test case for military policy in the 1970s. So he came out, was honorably discharged, and then sued for reinstatement, saying that this was illegal, that he couldn't be kicked out because he was gay. And he actually won the case. And you'd think that would be the end of it. But a couple things happened. The Air Force offered him a financial settlement, and he ended up accepting it. And he figured a couple things. It was only a matter of time, he figured, that he would be brought up on some other charge. There'd be some reason that the military would find to get him out of the way. And also, this is the late 1970s, so there are a lot of anti-gay, lesbian, transgender, bisexual politicians who are winning national offices like the presidency, winning places in Congress. And so he felt that the Air Force would appeal, and he would probably not do too well in the next fight. So he ended up not pursuing it any further. Excuse me. He died of HIV/AIDS-related illnesses in his early 40s. His tombstone is anonymous, and the quote on the tombstone there says, "When I was in the military, they gave me a medal for killing 2 men and a discharge for loving 1." People like Leonard Matlovich are important because they really changed the national dialogue. But we can't forget individuals, people like Michelle Evans. Michelle Evans is an Air Force veteran and a transgender woman. She is a child of the space race, and like many of her contemporaries, had a fascination with all things fast and flying. She enlisted in the Air Force in 1973, spending most of her time at Fairchild Air Force Base, another local connection up here, up in Spokane, Washington State. There she filled various roles, where her favorite, she says, was doing analysis. So she would do debriefing of planes as they came in. She'd create reports for commands on the base. As you might recognize from this photo, if you know missiles well, which I do not, but this is a nuclear missile. She worked alongside the nuclear arsenal, which gave her the opportunity for this photo op. She's a big fan of Dr. Strangelove, and could not pass up this opportunity when they were decommissioning these particular missiles to get a photo like this. Now, according to her, she planned to make the Air Force a career. and was on track to become an officer. She was filling out the paperwork, getting the approvals. She was on her way. But a couple things happened that really derailed this. She went into the military feeling like she had everything, quote, under control. Her first memory, she says, as a child is that she is a woman, though that may not have been how the world saw her. And when she disclosed this to her parents, they discouraged it, and she felt it was best not to disclose it to anyone from that point on. And she represents millions of people in aerospace who worked and still work every day to keep their GSM identity undisclosed, often so successful that they end up hiding it from themselves. About 6 years into her service, she was outed without her consent by 2 people on base who spread rumors about her. Now, she'd been there for a number of years and had an established positive reputation, so in general, people didn't believe these rumors, but it was enough to cause trouble that piled on and on and on. A big catalyst for this was that her squadron leadership left, and with it, the protection she had from the rumors. The new leadership came in and was much less friendly to her and apparently much more inclined to believe what was being said. This all culminated in her being set up by one of her commanding officers for an infraction for which she ultimately paid a fine and actually lost her rank. Now, by this time, she had been bullied into leaving the Air Force. She had gone from thinking this would be a career to something that was beyond miserable, and she knew she had to get out. But she believed that she'd earned the benefits that she was entitled to, that she lost when she was demoted. She exhausted legal recourses, and really just days from her enlistment ending, she threw a bit of a Hail Mary. She wrote to 60 Minutes explaining that there was bullying going on, explaining the situation, although leaving out the root cause. And 60 Minutes contacted the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington, D.C., who just happened to be an Air Force general, whose office looked into the issue and took action in Michelle's favor, restoring her rank and her pay, and robbing her, the officer who did this to her, of a cushy upcoming assignment in England, which, if you know anything about military, it's like the most passive-aggressive way to punish somebody. After the Air Force, she continued her career in the aerospace industry, completing a degree and working in aerospace engineering while simultaneously taking photos and writing about developments in the space program, like the space shuttle photo you just saw. One too many. She went on to write, oh my gosh, I'm losing control of my PowerPoint. She went on to write a book about the X-15, and those who are familiar with the space program know that the X-15 rocket plane is really one of the first steps, a major step in studying speed that helped lead to the Apollo program and the moon landing. She started writing it almost immediately after leaving the Air Force and researched it for 30 years. It wasn't until after her gender confirmation surgery relatively recently that she said her brain just cleared enough for her to be able to finish it and actually do the writing involved. After word of her surgery spread in the X-15 community, some of the former pilots and military personnel that she had interviewed for the book swore off it and said that they would denounce it, say that she'd never spoken to them. Fortunately, as a good historian, she had recorded all of her interviews and was more than happy to provide tapes, show the checks, show the receipts. Excuse me. You might have heard this myth at some point in your life that HIV/AIDS was caused or brought to the United States by a promiscuous gay male flight attendant. Now, like I said, this is a myth, and we're going to debunk it. Gaetan Dugas is the flight attendant in question. Here's a photo of him. He was Canadian, flew for Air Canada. He was charismatic, athletic, well-traveled, had a lot of relationships and hookups in a lot of cities, and died of HIV/AIDS-related illness in the United States. Now, his story really intersects with the United States here. So how did this happen? How did this reality become this myth that he's this guy who brought this to the United States? Well, when the extent of the HIV/AIDS epidemic started to become more and more apparent, scientists went looking for causes. And the CDC, Center for Disease Control, started looking to trace the AIDS epidemic in California. And as part of this study in California, they included Gaetan Dugas. And Dugas was included in this study, listed as patient outside California, meaning that he was part of this California study, but he wasn't in California. This patient outside California was shortened to Patient O, standing for patient outside, O, outside. This O was either misread or maybe even willfully misinterpreted as Patient Zero. So Gaetan Dugas becomes Patient Zero. And for those looking for an answer or for a scapegoat, Dugas is a perfect Patient Zero. He's homosexual. He's a promiscuous homosexual who is the perfect person who people who want to kind of propagate this notion that AIDS is a gay disease or some sort of punishment, they could just point their finger and say, brought it on themselves, point it at him, say Patient Zero, and be done with it. Now, in the wider context, yes, HIV/AIDS does impact the GSM community at a higher percentage, but it does impact other populations, especially populations of color, disproportionately. Anyone can contract HIV/AIDS, ranging from individuals with low immunity already to otherwise healthy people who aren't careful. So I think it's important for us not to underestimate this pressure to really cultivate this image. These are the same forces that kept President Reagan from saying a single word publicly about AIDS for 6 years, until after 20,000 Americans had died. Now, this isn't a perfect analogy, but in COVID-19, by the time 20,000 Americans had died, we were in lockdowns. And now we have a vaccine within a year. We still don't have a vaccine for HIV/AIDS. Never mind that it was medically impossible for Gaetan Dugas to have introduced HIV/AIDS to the United States. HIV/AIDS has been traced now back to the 1960s, which is long before Dugas told his first passengers to keep their seatbelt fastened and obey all lighted signs. So setting aside the social reasons influencing, clearly he does not deserve the legacy he's been given of single-handedly unleashing this vicious disease on an unsuspecting public, as it has so often been portrayed. Let's go to the stars. Sally Ride is the first American woman in space. She went on 2 missions for NASA. Before that, she was an astrophysicist and was accepted into the astronaut program in 1978 with that first class of women that were accepted into the astronaut program. She had a lot of pressures when she was first. She got asked a lot of questions, things like, are you going to cry if something goes wrong in space? Or what kind of makeup are you taking into outer space? I know Buzz Aldrin still gives a lot of interviews, and I would love for anyone to ask Buzz either of those questions. She went on to be an inspiration for women everywhere. She advocated for girls and women to pursue careers in STEM. She actually teamed up with her childhood friend, Tam O'Shaughnessy, to write a couple of children's books about planets and space exploration. She was very private about her personal life. She did marry an astronaut, Stephen Hawley. That marriage lasted from 1982 until 1987. She was so tight-lipped about her personal life that she actually kept the details of her cancer out of the public, out of the press, which was the disease that killed her in 2012. And after she died, we found something out. Sally Ride came out very quietly in her obituaries, saying that she had been living with her partner, Tam O'Shaughnessy, for years by that point. Tam O'Shaughnessy, if you remember, she was the woman that Sally Ride wrote those books with, making Sally Ride the first known GSM astronaut. Now, that's very specifically worded. Sally Ride is the first known GSM astronaut. And I'll ask you to put in chat, what do you think that means? What does this imply about her? Take a second, put a response in chat if you'd like. I'll take a sip of water because clearly I need it. What it tells me is that there may have been people who came before her who were what we would today call GSM. One thing important to remember about the early astronauts for the Mercury, the Gemini, and the Apollo program is that they were mission-driven. They wanted to get to space, and they would not let anything get in their way. And as the space race unfolded, NASA was obsessed with sending this image of the ideal American up into space. These astronauts were the ideal Americans, the best of America, up against the best of Russia. And the best of America, to them, was someone who was white, who was straight, who was married. These people knew that any sort of slip-up might get them the bag and get them away from this goal of going to the moon, being that first person to walk on the moon or the second or any part of this program. Now, I'm not saying I have any special information or insight. For all we know, every single astronaut was straight. But I do question, would we even know if they weren't? This program was so intense, and the pressure on them to maintain happy, perfect marriages was so much that it was taking a toll on them. We have evidence from the wives of these astronauts that some of them were contemplating suicide, some of these wives, because they were just so beholden to this ideal image of womanhood. And the only thing that kept them going was the other women around them. This is not an environment where someone's going to surreptitiously come out of the closet. So there's a question mark in that period of history, which is why she's the first known GSM astronaut. Back in aviation, let's talk a little bit about Karen Ullrich. Karen is a transgender woman. She was an Army pilot in the Vietnam War, where she received an air medal with 8 clusters. She was even a pilot instructor for the Army before she left. She joined Eastern Airlines in 1968, which is the same airlines, if you remember, from William Simpson from earlier, as a pilot. And she served the airline well, rising through the ranks for over a decade, presenting as male. In 1980, she underwent what we today call gender confirmation surgery, and began the process of switching her birth certificate and pilot's license and FAA credentials and other legal documents to reflect her gender. Eastern found out about this and fired her in 1981, listing 5 reasons they were firing her, and all 5 were directly related to her surgery or her transgender identity. She turned around and sued Eastern under the Civil Rights Act. And this is a pretty landmark lawsuit. And because it's a lawsuit, by the way, all these legal documents give us a remarkable amount of insight into her life. She sued under the Civil Rights Act, which is the same law I mentioned earlier, by the way, that the male flight attendants used to get back into the cabin. She roundly won the case. So, for example, one argument that Eastern Airlines made was that by undergoing the surgery, Karen, quote, and this is them talking, changed from the person Eastern hired into a different person, end quote. And the judge pointed out that Eastern's own words admitted discrimination based on sex. Essentially that if Karen had presented herself as a woman, she would not have been hired. So already they were on those grounds discriminating against us. They also claimed, quote, notoriety that would follow Eastern's use of you as a pilot would undermine the effort to reassure passengers as to the safety of air transportation, end quote. So claiming that if passengers knew that she was flying, they would be uncomfortable and think she would crash the aircraft or something like that. The judge pointed out that an Eastern pilot and his wife had posed in varying degrees of dress for Playboy magazine, and Eastern had no problem with notoriety there. Like Matlovich before her, her legal victory did not have the long-term effect that we might hope. She won initially, but lost the appeal, which set the precedent for transgender rights in workplace that lasted for many years following that. It's a bit of a bittersweet ending to her story in that she died in a DC-3, a very iconic plane. She died in a crash in 1989. And when she died, the Experimental Aircraft Association, in their tribute, used her correct name and pronouns. And for those outside the aviation world, the Experimental Aircraft Association is a big deal. You might have heard of the fly-in in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. This is a big deal organization in aviation. And for them to use correct pronouns and the correct name is a wonderful testament to progress being made, even though it feels like a couple steps back for every step forward. In 1994, Don't Ask, Don't Tell is put into place, which only talks about homosexuality, does not talk about trans individuals. Those were separate rules that excluded them from military service. What Don't Ask, Don't Tell did was essentially remove the screening, the questions about sexual orientation. So back during World War II, remember, they started asking you, are you homosexual? It removed that. Everything else functionally stayed the same. Still couldn't be trans, you still couldn't be gay, you still couldn't be bi, you still couldn't be any GSM identity and openly admit it, or you would be thrown out of the military. These images are from a delightful comic that I found detailing how to handle Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Don't Ask, Don't Tell immediately faced several legal challenges. The one I'm going to talk about to wrap up our conversation here was WHIT versus the Department of the Air Force. So WHIT was outed without her consent while serving at Joint Base Lewis McChord, another local connection here. Joint Base Lewis McChord is just a few miles south of Seattle. There's a lot of Seattle connections to these stories. She was in a relationship with a married woman who was living in Spokane, and her husband found out. The married woman's husband found out and called the base and outed Margaret without her consent. She was honorably discharged in the mid-2000s, but she sued, claiming that this was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause. And she won. She won her suit. And they prepared just like those before her for the appeal. But this was and now we're in the 2010s. And the Air Force dropped their appeal in May 2011. It's because behind the scenes, things were going on. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was on its way out. It was repealed a few months later by the President Obama's administration. The legal groundwork had already been laid by Congress in 2010. And so when it was officially ended in 2011, the military's official ideal American label could again be applied to gay and bisexual and lesbian individuals, although others in the GSM community, specifically trans people, were still held at arm's length. The Obama administration lifted a ban on transgender people in the military, which the Trump administration put back into place. And then the Biden administration, just a few days ago, on January 25th, 2021, reversed that ban, which feels good, but is also a reminder of how fickle reality can be, how easily it can all be taken away. We've covered 100 years of history in the last hour. Thank you for going on this whirlwind adventure with me. Hopefully, you've seen three themes emerge from this talk. First, that documenting the history of marginalized populations is tough, but vital. We talked about how aerospace history is GSM history. These are inseparable. And finally, the concept of the ideal American and how it has evolved and changed over time. I hope you find this as an entry point into a better and more complete understanding of a broader history. If you're interested, I have some recommended resources, readings, websites you can check out to learn a bit more. I'm ready to take questions.
Thank you so much, Sean, for coming on. We're going to take questions from folks who are watching. I know there's a little bit of a delay, but there's been some really wonderful conversations happening in the chat. So I hope that folks have some wonderful questions for you. I wanted to ask you to start off, how did you kind of come to creating this talk? You said you've been working on it for a while. What inspired you to find these folks in this hidden history?
Yeah, a couple things. One was that for my work with the docents, the Museum of Flight continues to be dedicated to diversity and inclusion, and that effort has been really ramping up in the past couple of years since I've been working there. Now, I work with docents, and a lot of these individuals, these are amazing people, but they grew up in a different time, and the way they talk about and the stories that they know and the way they talk about them can be different than what a modern audience wants. A lot of them might not be interested, to be perfectly honest, or might not realize or think or might be uncomfortable with taking steps towards telling a more diverse story in aviation, or they might not even know where to start. So that's where this came about, was to be a tool to help them get more comfortable, to help them learn some stories and give them some places to jump off. And then from there, it grew into something I did for our staff internally, and then now I presented it for the Smithsonian and for y'all. And so it's been pretty cool. And I'm working on a follow-up now on specifically on World War II and the GSM experience there.
Wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about what your kind of research process has been for these? I know, some of these you had to go through court records, and I know that you've worked with our reference archivist Isaac Fellman on some things, specifically for the pink stocking. Talk a little bit about how you actually went about finding some of the information that you've been building all of this on.
Yeah, a lot of disparate sources. Good places to start are the internet. Even good places to start, I'll say it, is Wikipedia as a starting point, because then what you do is you go down to the sources down below and you find those, because usually those are great. The article will give you a starting point, and then you go on and go from there, and then you far outpace what happened there. So I recommend anybody, whenever they want to start researching, start with the wiki. Do not stop there. So that's where I found a couple of books that I was able to reference. And then that leads down. Anyone who's done history work knows that once you start, it just becomes this.
It's a rabbit hole. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Wikipedia isn't a source, but it is a wonderful aggregate.
Yeah. And reaching out to folks, that's another thing I encourage people to do if they're interested in researching any of this, is reach out to people who are doing work in this field. If someone's written a book, email them. Don't be afraid. I felt the first iteration of this did not include really much in terms of the transgender experience. And this was a blind spot for me. And I knew that. So I reached out to transgender historians and said, what can we find? What's out there? And they were able to help me. And so this is all the richer for it. And then a couple people I've started actually interviewing on my own, like Michelle Evans. I don't think she's here tonight, but she's very involved in California GSM LGBT causes, and I found her website actually because we were doing an internal presentation on the X-15, and a question came up from it. So I Googled that, found her site, and she's got a lot of information on her site. Oh shoot, I should add her site to this. Lots of her story on there. And then I reached out to her and said, would you be willing to sit for an interview? And so that's how we got Michelle's story. And that's how these stories get documented. And if no one does it, then we don't have them.
Right. Yeah. Oral history is one of the best tools that we have, as fallible as memory can be. Yes. We have a question from our own Isaac. I'm going to put it up on the screen here. Have you done any work on the Mercury 13, the women who applied to be early astronauts, many of whom worked demonstrating planes for corporate buyers? Curious about whether there's any queer connection.
Yeah, that's a good question. So for those who are interested in learning more about the Mercury 13, I'll point you to Museum of Flight podcast, museumofflight.org/podcast. We did a 2-episode arc on the Mercury 13. As Isaac summarized here, the Mercury 13 was this shadow group of female astronauts who underwent the same medical testing and stress testing that the Mercury male astronauts underwent. It wasn't an official NASA program, but it was funded by a lot of people who wanted to become an official program. In fact, it ended up getting killed off when they wanted to use a Navy facility and for the next set of testing, because they'd exhausted their ability to test on their own. And so they contacted the Navy and said, hey, can we use your testing facility? And the Navy said, oh, sure, we'll just have NASA let us know. And NASA didn't want it to happen. In fact, there's a memorandum from the president at the time, I don't remember who it is, saying, let's kill this in the water right now, basically. And that was the end of it. So I have not investigated it specifically for queer connections. That's a great idea for research. I will say, and this is just some inferences I have based on knowing some of the people involved, specifically Jackie Cochran, who's a very controversial figure in aviation. She would have made a great Apollo astronaut because she was very specifically goal-driven, and she wanted to be involved in this program. And she was somebody who, she actually ran a program called WASP, Women Air Service Pilots, in World War II, which she was so tight-fisted over on the image. Like, you had to be very specific images to be part of the WASP, because she worried if anything deviated from what was expected of women's image, that it would kill the whole program. And so, so just knowing that about her makes me wonder, and knowing that she was involved in the program makes me wonder how much we'll find there. But I think it's a great idea, and I'll go looking.
Yeah, that reminds me a little bit about, and I would be surprised to think that there wasn't a single queer person in this group, but that just reminds me of the Night Witches too. Have you looked at all into any connections with them? For folks who don't know, the Night Witches were a group of World War II all female aviators
In Russia.
In Russia, yeah. And so, I mean, I just feel like there's, if it's not, queer in actuality, it's definitely queer in concept.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend about something similar. I was wondering if there was a story. I was wondering, oh, should I include this? And he's like, queer doesn't mean, like, what is queer, right? I feel like I'm in philosophy class now, but especially when you're working with historical figures where they didn't necessarily identify themselves. I mean, the words that we use today maybe didn't even exist. And so that was actually a problem in World War II. When they were doing these screenings, they were asking people, are you a homosexual? And a lot of people didn't know what that word meant. So they said, no, I'm not, even though they were gay. That's a good idea. It's out. I haven't looked at it for this because this focuses on US. I will recommend, if people are interested, there is a graphic novel out there. It puts the graphic and graphic novel. It's a war story. So be ready for it. And then if you want to do something really interesting with the Night Witches story, there's actually a role-playing game based on the Night Witches put out by someone who does some really good stuff. I haven't played it myself, but it looks really cool. Put out there by Jason Morningstar, I think. So if you want to take just a very different approach, if you like creative co-creation of history as a way to explore, I would recommend checking that out.
Wonderful. We've got a question here from Mira Dubdubs, which is, in your opinion, what's the most interesting GSM aviation story that you've heard so far? Also, an excellent little avatar you've got there.
That's a tough one. There's a couple that I'm working on. Like it's almost like, what's the most recent one? I've done a lot more. What's it called? Primary research with what I'm doing for the World War II presentation. So some of those are pretty interesting to me. I will say that in terms of character, Helen Harder is her oral history, which is freely available. And if you want some bedtime reading that'll just delight you to no end, she, like, the clips, the quotes that I used in this are almost the only thing that you can say without swearing. And the punchline is that she was a kindergarten teacher. So she is a salty lady. who tells just these amazing stories of like hitchhiking across the country. Yeah, so that's a really tricky question. In terms of character, she's one of those standout, like larger than life characters who could easily be made into a film. There's a lot of great people. I have really enjoyed my conversations with Michelle Evans. Also, I know I have to be careful not to like lionize somebody who is both still living and who we're kind of researching. It's careful for historians to go down, but she has a really compelling story. I've only been able to share a short fraction of it here, but I would recommend checking out her website for more.
Wonderful. Let's see. Does anyone else have any questions for Sean in the chat? I could just show some other lovely comments that we got towards the beginning when you asked folks who was showing up tonight and why folks were here. We've got Mira also said that they are an LGBT aviatrix themselves.
Awesome.
And
awesome.
We've got someone was here from an international LGBTQ Facebook group. So awesome. Wonderful.
Cool. Thank you all for coming. And I hope you have a chance to share some of your story in the comments, or my contact information is up here too. I'd love to, at the very least, hear from you and get to know your story a little bit.
Yeah. And please check out the podcast that Museum of Flight puts on as well.
Yeah.
So if we don't have anything else tonight, you know what? We've got one more comment.
The auto transcribing of my voice changed my word to something else. Never mind.
So we have a question. How do you feel about the future of GSM people in aviation? Positive? Room to grow? Where do we go from
always room to grow. Yeah. The perhaps now overused quote from Martin Luther King that the long arc of history bends towards justice, right? And then that's an idea that's very prevalent actually in African American communities, this idea that it will work out for good. The world is moving towards good is certainly something that I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. So yeah, I think definitely have been improvements, definitely room for improvement. I think especially in terms of legal protections, that's really a driving force at this point. We can have as much social acceptance as we want, but until people, especially people of color and trans people, have legal protections and access to healthcare reliably, then there's going to be room to grow. And that's something that advocacy groups like there's the National Gay Pilots Association is a part of that. So if you're in the aviation community and it says gay pilots in there, but it's the whole community. This is an organization that's been around for a long time. It started in back rooms when to be out would be to get fired, and language was different back then too. And it was also, frankly, mostly guys because guys were pilots. So, but it has evolved a long way. They've got a lot of advocacy there, and then the military too. The presentation used to end on a pretty down note when I was like, and the protections for trans military are repealed. And now I can end on a more positive note. But the fact that in 10 years, protections were put in place and then taken out and then put back in place, it just shows us that we have to stay vigilant. But yes, better. End on a positive note.
To think, and know that we're kind of, you get to end on a high note, and hopefully we're looking forward to at least a slightly brighter future as we go on. Sean, I want to thank you so much for being with us here tonight, and it's been a really wonderful pleasure to get to know you and get to know your work. And I know that it's been a delight to have you research in our archives, and I hope that we get to see each other in person at some point in
Absolutely.
the archives when we are in a space where it is safe to do so.
Thank you very much.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in for tonight. I just wanted to remind folks, first off, to check out the Museum of Flight in Seattle at museumofflight.org. And you can also find out about the podcast over there. And also, if you are not currently a card-carrying member of the GLBT Historical Society, I highly encourage you to join and become a member at glbthistory.org/join-give. I hope that everyone has a wonderful evening, stays safe, and has a pleasant weekend. So
Absolutely.
have a good night. Thank you so much, Sean. And
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll see you at some point in Seattle in the future.
Hopefully.
All right. Bye, everyone. Have a good evening.